So again, welcome everyone. My name is Javier Garcia. I work for ActionAid International as Head of Engagement for Europe and the Americas. ActionAid is a federation working for social justice, gender equality, and poverty eradication. And I have the pleasure and the responsibility to moderate this webinar today, which is around the future of aid under threat and what new rules for PSI mean for aid budgets. So when I read the title and I see under threat, I get scared, but I think that we should be aware of what is happening right now. And I hope this webinar can help us to understand what are the trends already in terms of ODA and particularly related to the private sector instruments. Just to mention some of the comments or the elements that the report that we are going to listen today is that in a moment where 130 million people will slide back into poverty in the next 10 years due to COVID and due to the war in Ukraine, and figure that will probably get worse due to the climate change impact, I think it's super relevant and super important to look again about what's going on with aid, and particularly the growing trend about what is going on with the new private sector instruments. No, we will have the opportunity today to look at these ODA trends, particularly in relation to these private sector instruments. We will also hear today about these new OCDE rules for reporting private sector instruments. But not only what is written in paper, but we will also listen about what is happening in the Global South and what our colleagues from CSOs in the Global South are looking about those private sector instruments initiatives in their territories. And then finally, we will also check on those particular environments. One is the EU, and we will look at the role of the European Investment Bank, and the second one will be the UK. So we will look also at the development finance institution that is operating there. No, for that we have 5 great panelists. Apologies in advance if I mispronounce your surnames, but we will have first Nerea Cravieto, which is the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at the European Network on Debt and Development, Eurodat. I think Nerea is below me in my screen. Not sure if it's the same for you. Nerea leads Eurodat's advocacy and coordinates CSO work towards the OECD Development Assistance Committee, with a focus on improving the effectiveness of aid and change the way publicly backed private finance is used in development cooperation. Prior to working in Eurodat, Nerea has worked on policy and advocacy work on development policies with trade unions and feminist organizations, and has done a few years of programmatic work at country level in Palestine. So welcome, Nerea. We will also have Thomas Hoss from OECD. I can see Thomas in my screen. I hope he is there. But Thomas has been working at the Financing for Sustainable Development Division for the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate on various aspects of DAC statistics and total official support for sustainable development. I think Thomas is there. Yeah. From his capacity, he has supported a DAC members' review of the provisional reporting methods for private sector instruments, as well as statistical engagement with providers of development finance beyond DAC, including multilateral development banks and private philanthropic foundations. He was also closely involved in the development of the DAC standard for measuring private finance mobilization, and as SEC National, he holds degrees in EU policy, international economics, and history from University of Amsterdam. So welcome, Thomas, to this webinar today. Also, we will have Sara Torres from Reality of Aid. Sara is on my right. Sara is the coordinator of Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, a network of CSOs working on aid and development cooperation, and she also coordinates the Asia constituency of the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness, as well as the Peace and Security Thematic Working Group of the DAC CSO Reference Group. So Sandra, welcome to this. Welcome to this webinar. Then we also have Alexandra Gerasimkova, sorry, Alexandra, from more or less, no? From Counterbalance. So Alexandra works at Counterbalance, a Brussels-based network of 9 European NGOs working on a progressive reform of European public finance, focusing on the European Investment Bank, and she has written pieces in several media outlets, including on European green and industry policy and development finance in Palestine. And finally, welcome Alessandra. And finally, we have Sandra Martinson. Sandra is leading bonds policy, advocacy, and research work on sustainable economic development issues with a strong focus on DFIs, trade and investment, food systems, G7 agenda, and broader global financial architecture. Previously, Sandra has coordinated international humanitarian capacity building programs in East Africa, Middle East, worked as politics and governance program manager at ODI, led a large international tax justice advocacy and campaigning project, working with 24 organizations in 19 countries across 3 continents, and developed advocacy strategy for ETI to advocate for worker rights in the UK, Southeast Asia, and Africa. She has also worked for UNDP and Foreign Office in Latvia. So awesome, Sandra, welcome to this webinar. The way we have structured the webinar, we will first start with Nerea that will present us the new Eurodat report. Then we will have interventions from the colleagues from the 4 panelists. After Nerea, we will open for Q&A at the end. So please, you have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can formulate your questions as the webinar is happening, and we will open for the space to try to address some of these questions at the end of the webinar. So over to you, Nerea.
Thank you, Javier, and thank you for everyone to joining us, starting by the colleagues, panelists joining me on today's session, but also to all participants. I'm gonna share my screen, just a moment. So starting with what I will be covering today, I do my best to meet the 10 minutes. I might be 11, Javier, sorry for that.
Okay.
I'm squeezing a lot of information here, but basically I will be providing some highlights on the new reporting rules for private sector instruments, and then share with all of you some highlights on the analysis of the PSI ODA data available from 2018 to 2021, which has been implemented under the old rules. And this is important to know, because now there are new rules that were agreed last October, at the end of October. And then some messages for the role of CSOs going forward. Here, there is a timeline. We will share the PowerPoint presentation afterwards, so I'm not going to go into detail with the timeline, but basically just to say that the PSI, these PSI negotiations and agreement are part of a broader process that is the ODA modernization process that started in 2012. A key moment for PSIs has been in 2018 when temporary rules were agreed by DAC members. And then PSIs started to be reported as ODA, and this is what our report is looking at, the latest data available for that, and this is 2018 to 2021. And as I was saying last, I think 31st of October, new rules have been agreed, and they would be implemented from 2023, and first available data will be from April 2024. About the new agreement, what are the highlights that I would like to share with all of you from an Eurodat point of view? And this is this agreement of October 2021 is the first step towards towards replacing concessionality, which is the principle that all the resources should be channeled to development. Channel to development cooperation must offer better terms than those from the market. So concessionality will be replaced by additionality at a moment where what countries across the world or the global south need the most is precisely concessional finance. This agreement also means the expansion of the eligibility of ODA to new private sector-oriented instruments, such as guarantees or mezzanines, which is interesting, for example, in the context of the European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus, which will allow to report as ODA some of the operations that are already ongoing. This agreement also means a step to report PSI's operations in grant equivalents to ensure coherence with the rest of the statistical system, notably with sovereign loans. And plus a generous methodology that shall further, that in our view will incentivize the ongoing private sector-oriented agenda that has been driven by DAC members and donors. And some DAC members have been already announcing some initiatives into that direction, like, for example, Norway or Sweden. It is also important to acknowledge that this agreement also means some positive steps that have been taken in establishing a set of safeguards and reporting mechanisms, plus a review of the whole package in 2030 that should reinforce the transparency and accountability around the PSI's operations reported by DAC members. And we will hear more during today's sessions about it. Maybe and from the data I will be presented after, these positive steps are very much welcome and are and it's a positive step in the right direction, but for these positive outcomes to really be positive, actually what we see is that DAC members will need to make an effort to implement on the requirements they have set for themselves with this new agreement. On the downward side also with this agreement and in terms of safeguards, what we would like to highlight at Eurodac is that no safeguards has been set to prevent the inflation of ODA with the profits generated by PSI operations. And this is particularly relevant for those DAC members that report their PSI ODA under the instrument approach, so operation by operation. Under these new rules, those profits generated by the PSI operations can be reinvested again, for example, in the development finance institution, and reported again, and then reported as ODA. With no budgetary effort from the state behind. And this is problematically, particularly, for example, in the context of DAC members for whom their ODA is capped by law. This is the case, for example, for the UK or Sweden. But it can also easily help some other countries, such as France or Spain, in meeting the ODA targets that they have set for themselves. For example, reaching the 0.7 by 2030. This, if I recall well, this is the target that Spain has set for himself. The documents are available at this link for those that of you that want to explore. In terms of what is the data telling us, why this is not moving? So in terms of what has happened with PSI ODA between 2018 and 2021, the amount of ODA reported as private sector instruments has been mostly growing. From 4.6 billion to 5.4 billion in 2021, showing a 18% increase. And since 2018, the levels of ODA channeled through private sector, and although since 2018, the levels of ODA private sector instruments have been stable at an average of 3% of the total ODA levels. What we are seeing behind this rather stable figure is that this is not the case for particular specific DAC members. So, for example, for Japan, PSI ODA has increased in the last between 2018 to 2021 by 440%, 124% for France, and 97% for Germany. So it is stable, but some members are already showing very important increases in their PSI ODA, and we expect more of this kind of trends with the new agreement, and also because some of those members are already stating their intention to do so. In terms of more on the volumes, between 2018 and 2021, 15 DAC members out of 32, plus the EU institutions have reported PSI ODA. And what the analysis of data is telling us is, interestingly, there are 4 DAC members, or 3 plus the EU institutions. They have a particular status in the DAC. That are and this is the UK, the EU, Germany, and France, that concentrate almost 80% of the total PSI reported for the 4 years. And another interesting data that came out of the analysis of the PSI ODA is that at least 80% of these funds were channeled by different development finance institutions. Most of them bilateral, but also the European Investment Bank. And here we have a list of those that appear in the data. In terms of geographic distribution, a vast majority of PSI ODA is going to upper middle income countries at an average of 59%. Followed by lower middle income countries. And what these figures confirm is that the profit-seeking nature of PSI's operation, as it is mostly directed to countries and regions that offer a low risk profile and secure profits. A note here to add of concern, and I won't be able to develop because for the sake of time, but I invite you to check further in the report. Is that so we are seeing that PSI ODA is going to upper middle income countries, lower middle income countries mostly, and those income groups are out of the untying recommendation that it's monitoring tie dates. So some tie day might be happening, and because it's out of the untying recommendation, it's not possible to track it. In terms of analysis on the data around additionality, DAC, what we are seeing out of this analysis is DAC members are failing to report information required by the 2018 PSI reporting rules, and this is notably on additionality. That is the primary criterion for private sector instruments to be ODA eligible, and that the criterion also that it's replacing concessionality. For example, for the total PSI ODA reported between these 4 years, 30% did not include any information on the type of additionality per se. These operations, when the additionality is measured by whether these operations are adding financial additionality, so something that the market could not offer financially for the operation, or value additionality, or both. And only around 50% of the reported PSI ODA includes some explanation on that could justify the other value financially or by value of these operations. And only around 53% includes some information on the development impact expected out of these operations. And considering that this new PSI agreement formalizes additionality as a defining characteristic for PSI ODA and replaces concessionality, it is highly concerning how poorly DAC members are reporting on these mandatory fields. And here it's very important to stress the fact that these requirements are mandatory. And from a CSO point of view, the failure to deliver and our role in tracking what is happening with ODA and how it's being used, the failure to deliver on the additionality requirements omits crucial information that allow us to assess whether ODA is effectively allocated according to what is more needed and can have more impact. And with this report, we also look at the 4 major PSI donors and their DFIs. So that was the UK, the EU, Germany, and France, because we were looking also at their DFIs, because I mean the related DFIs alone were channeling between 2018 and 2021 they channeled around 33% of the total PSI order reported for these 4 years. And we were also looking at how they were meeting the reporting requirements attached to PSI ODA. And what our assessment has shown us is that all related DFIs need to improve the quantity and quality of the data they share with the respective DAG members. So the DAG member can also report this information to the OECD system for ODA. The information gaps are particularly important regarding the additionality of PSI ODA operations and fundamental information, which is a fundamental information in the PSI context, and where the information it's available most of the time, it's either vague or rather inconclusive to allow a good assessment on the additionality of these operations. All our findings also show that these PSI operations could be hiding rising levels of tie dates. From the analysis of the available data for the 4 DAG members and their DFIs, that was not only for the UK and the EU, it is inconclusive to state whether formal or informal tie date could already be happening. And that's one of our recommendations, is that additional measures will be needed to track formal and informal tie date. Furthermore, as I was saying before, if most of PSI's operations are out of the scope of the untying recommendation. And considering that BII, which is a DFI for the UK, AIV for Europe, DEC and KUSW for Germany, and Proparco for France channel at least 73% of the total PSI ODA, it is reasonable to conclude that they are responsible for the identified information gaps. And so access to complete and consistent data is needed to justify the added value of these PSI operations in ODA and the role of DFIs within. To move into the recommendations for CSOs going forward.
Nerea, sorry to interrupt, but just 1 minute or 2 maximum, because we are...
Okay, yeah.
Yeah?
Maybe just walking very fastly on the recommendations. So our key demands or conclusion for CSOs going forward and the role is that we need to maintain the spotlight on the continuing need for non-PSI ODA and concessional development finance, and hold DAG members account for their long-standing commitment to provide 0.7 of GNI as ODA. Also, the demand governments for evidence that justifies the inclusion of PSI in ODA. Also defend the integrity of ODA by monitoring PSI's operation and notably the role of DFIs within. Monitor the potential inflation of ODA under the new PSI agreement, because there will be inflation. And for example, with the profit, what happens with the profits generated by the DFIs and that are reinvested and reported as ODA. Continue to develop evidence and analysis that contributes to inform discussions on the impact of PSIs, and call for a definitive end of the ODA modernization process. And this last point is very important, because there were some instruments that were under discussion in the last negotiations, for example, in the case of bonds, that couldn't be agreed now because there was no mandate, but that what I know is that it's in the pipeline and that this will come back. So we really need to call for for an end of this modernization process. And I'm gonna stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nerea, for the great summary and for the effort to summarize this brilliant report in only 10 minutes. So to me, it's very concerning to see the increase in resources that from ODA are going to these instruments where we are clear that there is a gap in terms of information, and still there is no clarity about the added value that it's bringing into the development field. But we will hear more about, the positive element that Nerea has flagged in terms of information, and I think Thomas, both from OECD, can help us to understand better what is this new regulation bringing into the table to address this information gap. So Thomas, over to you.
Yes, good afternoon or good morning, colleagues. And first of all, let me express my gratitude for you having me in this forum. I'm really pleased to be with you, and it's great to continue our dialogue with the CSO community also after the review of the provisional reporting methods for PSI. As was already mentioned, I had the pleasure to accompany the DAC members in the review of the provisional reporting methods for PSI, which actually ended at the end of the last month, and I'm happy to share some insights from the process. Maybe I can start with some background information to complement what Nerea has shown on one of the slides, and then I can also provide you with our perspective on the new agreed rules for treating private sector instruments for ODA. I should also congratulate Nerea for the work on the private sector instruments that has resulted in the report. We have gone through it with colleagues. It looks like a great piece of work indeed. So on private sector instruments, maybe I can first just recall where we are coming from. As the Secretariat of the Development Assistance Committee, Nerea has already shown then that some 10 years ago, DAC members agreed to modernize the ODA, so they agreed on some areas which should be modernized in particular, and one of them was private sector instruments. The other ones, which is quite important, included also a switch from cash flow measurement to grant equivalent measurement. In 2016, development ministers agreed on a set of principles how private sector instruments should actually be treated or reflected in official development assistance. We call those HLM principles in let's say the OECD DAC jargon. And the ministers then invite discussions on the implementation details. So how should one account precisely what kind of discount rates, what kind of provisions should actually be put in place to make it work in one way or another. But unfortunately, these discussions did not lead to an agreement on a permanent set of rules. So in 2018, DAC members could only agree on a set of provisional rules for treating private sector instruments. From the OECD point of view, we can only say that we have never hidden, I guess, that we considered the rules quite weak, and that they did not deliver on the expectations that were actually put forward in the 2016 principles and the expectations that the broader development community had in those times. We considered the rules quite inconsistent, just for the fact that they extended cash flow measurement while the rest of ODA was counted on a grant equivalent basis. So if you just imagine a loan that your government might extend to a developing country, if the loan goes to the public sector, it's counted on a grant equivalent basis. And if it goes to the private sector from the same budget, it counts on a cash flow basis. So there were some inconsistencies. It was also quite incoherent. I think that people who have actually looked into the methods might sometimes need some help to actually understand what they are reading and why they are reading what they are reading. There was also quite a significant lack of incentives to actually deploy some of the instruments for mobilizing private finance, and the incentives that it surely included were sometimes, if you wish, pervert. They did not invite a greater mobilization, but sometimes they rather invited a kind of creative reporting, and they were surely quite weak in building transparency and accountability. We have seen in Era's presentation that there are quite significant gaps in the data reporting on additionality and some other areas. Yes, indeed, this has been found also by the Secretariat as an issue. We were quite happy to see that members agreed a few years ago to review the provisional reporting methods for private sector instruments, and hopefully finally implement the principles that they agreed upon back in 2016. And yes, on the 31st of October, the DAC approved the last part of the methodological package on private sector instruments. So at this point of time, we have revised rules for treating private sector instruments in ODA, including accounting on a grant equivalent basis for loans to the private sector, for equities, for guarantees, for mezzanine finance instruments, and for reimbursable grants. I should say that the new rules do not affect transparency on cash flows. They only add a new accounting mechanism that is on a grant equivalent basis. So should somebody want to still see what flows out of developed countries or donor countries to developing countries and back, what are the reflows? All these pieces of information continue to be collected and shall be disclosed according to new rules. What I would also like to emphasize is that the revised methods seek or are much more ambitious in the area of transparency and accountability. While the provisional reporting methods included some let's say, voluntary reporting areas, or it was simply not clear whether some data should be or need to be reported, whether they are required or whether they can be reported. Now the rules are quite crystal clear. And for example, on additionality, if private sector instruments are, so the individual activities are reported without information additionality, they cannot be considered ODA eligible, and there are a set of safeguards that actually ensure that this information is reported, and if it is not, the Secretariat can actually take a measure to kind of adjust the reported ODA figures accordingly. There are also significant gains on accountability. Each and every vehicle that extends private sector instruments will need to be assessed on its ODA eligibility, looking into the mechanisms that the institutions have in place to ensure that they meet the ODA criteria. Previously, these assessments were self-assessments, so donors actually review their own vehicles and communicated the outcomes to the OECD. Now it will be the OECD Secretariat that will actually review the vehicles. Obviously, countries will still need to provide us with the information for the review. And one should also say that there will be regular monitoring in place. There will be biannual reports. So once every 2 years, the Secretariat will review the data and assess the extent to which they are complete, assess to the extent they actually convey all the necessary information in the context of private sector instruments. There will also be an exercise with the export credit community where we will be looking into how PSI and export credits interact, or how they resemble each other, or the extent to which they blur the lines or don't blur the lines. This is something which has also been agreed upon, and there will also be a review mechanism in the future. So should the methodology need to be adjusted, it will be possible. So I don't think one should see the methodologies as final and perpetual in place forever.
Thomas,
overall, yes.
Sorry, if you can try to finish your argument. Yeah.
Yes. So overall, I think that we can say that obviously the new revised methods are not perfect because it's an international policy. It underwent negotiations, but it provides a level playing field for PSIs. It removes certain perverted incentives. It requires more transparency and accountability. It removes, let's say, many footnotes from the ODA reporting directives, which is very important for the OECD, because we need to make sure that our system is in line with a good statistical practice. And the monitoring and review mechanisms are also quite important elements. Nothing is definitive, and there will be regular exercises looking in detail into this system going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Thomas, for your summary of these new regulations and what is bringing in terms of transparency and accountability that we are, as CSO, we are expecting so much to understand what are the impacts of those instruments. So before giving the word to Sarah, just to remind that colleagues can formulate some questions. If you go down in the screen, there is a Q&A button. You can press and formulate your questions to the panelists that will be addressed at the end of the session. So let's move now to Sarah Torres. Sarah, that she can give us the perspective of what's going on from the Global South and what are the impacts of those instruments in practice. No? So Sarah, over to you. You have please 5 minutes. So if you can stick to that time, I will appreciate.
All right. Good evening from Manila. I join others in thanking Eurodad, of course, for this time and space and for producing that briefing paper on PSIs and DFIs. So our work in CPDE, in Reality of Aid, and other platforms is very much technical, no? And it's our job to help the public understand the relevance of these statistics in their daily lives and the importance of these numbers. And that's where I'll hinge my intervention. So before this webinar, I actually came from an internal learning session of the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness, or CPDE, their private sector task force. And just another plug, they will be launching their second private sector watch, a compilation of case studies monitoring private sector intervention and development on November 23. But today I'll share some experience already and action points from that report. So for us, from the poorest and most marginalized communities, yet the richest in resources in the Global South, how these interventions, those numbers, those statistics actually translate are quick to understand. So for most of us, it translates as violence. Bloody or not, this means loss of land, which also means loss of livelihood, which means loss of food in simplest terms. And broadly, violence means degrading environment, which leads to resource conflicts, which lead to displacement and migration. Of course, we know this all too well, that these numbers have stories behind them. So it is as critical that when we speak of these statistics and when we talk about these methodologies, we talk about these stories also. So in Egypt, one of the recipient countries mentioned in the briefing paper, the dominant mode of private sector engagement, or PSE, is primarily in the form of debt and equity instruments. And the Benban Solar Park is one example. It's a case study also from the second private sector watch. So this Benban Solar Park, it is actually considered now as the largest photovoltaic power plant in the world. It has 41 solar power plants. And it's a public-private partnership between, of course, the government and several multilateral and regional banks, including the EBRD, and of course, private corporations. So on paper, it's very good to look at. It speaks to SDG 7 and 13. That's affordable, clean energy and climate action. But from the ground, the experience here shows how, unfortunately, Agenda 2030 is used as a patina covering business as usual practices. So for most interventions, really, even if we say we should move away from business as usual, this is the case. And the affected communities are they feel neglected by the response of the government and its partners, because the promises for jobs, livelihood, schools, were not really met. So the trade-offs were not adequately responded by the government. And apart from this loss of land and loss of livelihood, this resulted in conflict among community members and with the government and project staff coming from outside the village. So the communities are asking, are the trade-offs worth it? They might not think so. But of course, ultimately, weak government regulation and economic planning have allowed private sector entities to direct financing and state resources towards projects that are intended to generate profit for corporations, what we call corporate capture, than responding to the needs of the population. So in the research with 9 case studies, most of them demonstrate how governments have legitimized the damage caused by private sector interventions instead of protecting and upholding public interest. So we talk about this lack of incentives. We talk about sort of replacing concessionality with additionality. But here we are. Are the incentives worth it? No? What do we mean by lack of incentives? Are the actual the current incentives not even showing prospects of development for most communities in the global South, and as well as with the additionality. How do we say the private sector interventions have actually done or provided better lives for most communities, because case studies show otherwise. However, of course, this is not to say that the private sector can't do anything good, right? But for them to be truly impactful, they have to be really transparent and accountable. And some of the recommendations from the Private Sector Watch, which also resonate to Eurodad's briefing paper's recommendations, include 1, governments should review and in some cases revoke approval for current PSE projects that promote corporate and donor interests at the expense of sustainable pro-people development. They should also ensure that as early as the proposal and planning stages, private sector initiatives are geared to contribute to long-term development plans at the national and subnational levels even. 3, in conducting its business and development initiatives, private sector entities must comply with international standards and regulations regarding labor, gender, the environment, and other human rights issues. 4th, governments must further develop oversight and regulatory mechanisms in coordination with civil society to ensure that the private sector upholds the Kampala principles. 5th, governments must support and encourage alternative, non-corporate modalities of PSE that have been proven capable of producing positive social and environmental outcomes. And lastly, all development actors should create an enabling environment for civil society, especially community-based and people's organizations, to really monitor PSE or private sector engagement and hold governments, both recipient and donor governments and private actors, accountable. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Sarah. It's great to hear that there is stories behind the figures, and those stories have impacts that we as CSO are able to check and measure and monitor. No, thanks a lot for your contribution. So let's move now to Alexandra. I think Alexandra will explain us about the EIB here in the European Union and what is the EIB behavior in terms of these private sector instruments. And I think that you will talk also a bit about the global gateway, if I am not wrong. No? So over to you, Alejandra, but please consider we have 5 minutes. Yeah.
Hi, Javier. Thanks a lot. Thank you for the invitation. And I echo the congratulations for the great report. I mean, we all in the NGO community know how intransparent a lot of the data can be. So we were impressed to see that you managed to get really great report together. Just briefly, maybe a bit about at the beginning about the EIB to understand why this institution is important to look at with regard to ODA. So overall, the bank is a very huge financial institution. Its balance sheet is over 540 billion euro, which makes it twice the size of the World Bank, and I think even like over 10 times of EBRD. The EIB global operations, of course, are much smaller. They're around like 9 billion euro of signed projects the last year, as opposed to like 72 billion signed generally. So again, it's like a small portion, but still very important because it combines, I think, like around 1/3 of the EU development aid. A lot of the concessional loans, they meet the threshold for the ODA reporting. I think this was also reflected in the report. And the EIB is the key implementer of the EFSD Plus guarantee, again, which complements a lot of the EIB projects abroad. From our perspective, I'd like to mention maybe 3 main issues that we see with the private sector instruments used by an institution like the EIB, because at Counterbalance, we monitor the bank with regard to its type of projects, transparency standards, human rights standards, accountability mechanisms, development ownership, etc. And on all these accounts, it has weak indicators and very slow change. So despite advocacy by many NGOs, many politicians, institutions, the bank is very, very slow to change. Hence, while the PSI rules, for example, shift, we are very afraid that on the EIB, the developments don't really match the pace of the developments. First, I would say that the EIB is a very risk-averse institution. Like its internal culture, it's still very profit-oriented despite the bank's mandate to be non-profit. And in this regard, we are wondering what's the additionality of EFSD Plus money that it is using, because a lot of this information is not transparent. For example, if you look at the information that EIB publishes about the project, the additionality element, or like, in other words, why it chooses to combine the project with the guarantee from the EU, it's not reported. In some of the other projects that EIB implements, for example, inside of the EU, this is explained better. But for example, one of the reasons that it can use is to just diversify sources of funding. So for us to see maybe that with the new rules, the detailed explanation will be more interesting that the EIB will be providing. And we hope that this data will be transparent so that CSOs can actually monitor what is this additionality. While it's risk averse, also it's interesting to note that earlier this year, there was an ECA report in the NDICI, like in the EU development aid budget, that actually stressed that some of the EFSD Plus guarantees exceeded the demand, exceeded the requirements in some of the countries. I think some of them were mostly in Asia that the report mentioned. For example, because of the internal over-indebtedness rules. So even in some cases, actually, it's too many guarantees that are used as opposed to maybe better project decision making. Second, I would say the biggest issue that we have is that this type of instruments contributes to the so-called financialization of development policies. Maybe, to give a concrete example, to illustrate better, the EIB very often uses financial intermediaries to finance their projects. Again, this leads to a lot of intransparency with regard to the project cycle, but also the intermediaries that are used can be very often like a profit maximizing institutions. So it's not just about making projects viable or sustainable financially, but actually profit-making institutions, which then again turns certain public services, for example, or like agricultural support, it transfers it into financial terms. This type of project, for example, was financed recently in Côte d'Ivoire through a project named Cofina, which is like again a for-profit financial institution. Interestingly enough, whose CEO is not getting a banking license from authorities in the country. So again, a lot of concerns to use these types of instruments and then report it as development aid if the results are just not evident or reported. Third biggest issue I think we have is the fact that the results are unknown. Already with EFSD, before it was reported that a lot of the projects were not even yet started, which is the same now with EFSD Plus and with a lot of the global gateway projects, which means that basically we have no idea how this money is actually used. Like if the guarantees go to projects that have development additionality or not, and when the guarantees would be actually called. That might take many, many years. So again, we don't know what's that reported as ODA eventually, and we might know that maybe in 10 years. Last note, because I see I already have very limited amount of time, maybe I would rather mention something interesting that Thomas raised with regard to export credit. With the EIB, for example, this is also an increased trend on the EU level now to start enhancing coordination between development finance and export credits. From our side, we see this as very problematic because of challenging the mandate of development finance institutions. While we already see increased focus on private sector in development finance with the so-called leveraging effect, de-risking private sector, increasing use of the export credit agencies for this can just further this trend in finance. Again, an example would be a project that the EIB is financing in Brazil with regard to renewable energy. I think it's financed with Enel, if I'm not mistaken, or one of the huge energy corporations. And it's also being de-risked by SACE, who provides a guarantee for the project in case this would lead to more investments apart from this development finance project. Again, the big question is whether these types of projects are reported as ODA, and what's the rationale behind financing things together with export credit agencies eventually, and what's the distinction between, because indeed, as Thomas mentioned, the lines become more and more blurred, and there is zero transparency in understanding what's the rationale of bringing in the export credit agency, either by the EIB or by the EU institutions in this regard. So I'm happy to leave it at this and see if there are questions and answers.
Thanks, Alessandra. Interesting to know what's going on with the EIB, despite again, the transparency is still something there is margin to improve, I would say. Let's hope that in the UK we have a different reality. Sandra, can you tell us if the reality is different in the UK?
Hello, everyone. I'm not sure I'm bringing, more positive news, to be honest. But let's kick on. And I think, again, as well, huge congratulations to Eurodad for this report. Very timely, and I think in a way it does actually complement with our work. So doesn't actually come as a surprise, a lot of the things. Anyway, I'll try to be quite brief, but maybe bringing kind of up things which might be interesting to share from UK side. So what I'm saying is that it's not a surprise. So in 2022, International Development Strategy was published, with the British international partnerships as a one big, huge priority, where BII, which is our DFI, is a critical part of that. So reliable investment in trade is one of the key priorities and kind of presented as key pathways to development. So it's all in line with I think what we see here is with that strategy. So as you may know, of course, as well, though UK was really the champion for some time, reaching the 0.7, meeting the target. But since 2020, so it's back to it's lower now, 0.5, and clearly this is also in combination with other things such as in-country refugee costs, as you know, which are charged to ODA, also vaccine donations, Also climate finance as well, which in UK doesn't really see as additional, but really kind of part of ODA. So we obviously see really clear actually decline of actual ODA, like aid money going for development and humanitarian programs. It's a pure mass. And obviously this statistics as well from this report that 22% of ODA goes to PSI instruments, so private sector instruments. So it adds to that. And yes, BII is one big element in that. So just giving a bit kind of as well the numbers and kind of just to put in the perspective. So essentially what is currently the kind of the trend around 580 million a year, being given to BII, it will go to 1 billion and more annually, which means, from the current around 4% of total ODA budget going to BII, it will go to about 7% of ODA. And that's basically about, double what UK is giving for education. It's about as much as what we're giving for health in total. And it's also is double what goes to IDA, if you either the World Bank instrument for the least developed countries. So if you put in perspective, this is actually quite huge amount what is going to BII. When it comes to the focus on poverty or low-income countries, it is definitely less than 20%. There's actually the percentages actually differ, from report to report, but definitely it's not a huge focus on low-income countries. So clearly that is as well making it more problematic, together with the fact that obviously this is mostly, definitely not grant money. BII isn't giving really grants. There's a little bit of technical kind of assistance, but not really. So again, in the context also debt crisis, 36 low-income countries in that huge debt crisis, adding more these kind of debt-based, instruments is, it raises questions, right? How exactly is complementing. Then maybe the other point is which was also Alexandro raising, obviously intermediaries, is they are hugely used, which means, that they actually do have very little power or influence once the deal is signed, what's actually happening, both even in terms of, compliance with any kind of, human rights, environment, the social kind of standards, but just generally also about, the impact and the kind of knowledge of what those investments are really doing. Then the other point where we are really concerned as well is though I don't like the word beneficiaries, but still, so who is really benefiting, from this? And what we see often as well, that those probably end up, being a lot, in many cases, really international businesses, international capital, who basically get these more opportunities to do businesses in low-income countries, and it is that question, is that enough for the impact to be counted the impact, that we do business in low-income country, or it really is about, that is local economies, local entrepreneurs, local businesses, being supported and nurtured. There's a big question as well about profits. So FCDO, the UK government, has set 3.5% as the kind of, what is the profitability of these investments, what they need to reach. In 2021, it was 11%. So the question is as well, is great from one side, but again, maybe with the lower profit margin, they could actually have achieved, a more development impact. So that is also, and where is that space for these kind of conversations or decisions to be discussed or challenged, right? When it comes to also, I just wanted to a little bit touch up on, where really is invested, so the key countries are India, Egypt, and Nigeria. In terms of the strategy and kind of criteria, how these investments are made. Again, the BI's new strategy talks about inclusion, sustainability, and productivity. But actually, when it comes to you look really at the model, you don't actually need to meet, all those criteria. So, it could be something productive and sustainable, but not inclusive, and, other kind of combinations, plus those even inclusion is very narrow interpretation of kind of gender representation, or sustainability actually means just some of the environmental climate kind of stuff, not for example, social sustainability. So these are very limited. And also when it comes to really decision making as well, we see that this is very kind of top down, you know. So where's the kind of the voice and legitimacy of the partner countries actually as well to have some kind of conversations, have some kind of influence on where these investments are going? Are they going really where those countries are really the most need, you know, or it's really about, you know, where essentially they see bankable, as they call it, bankable projects. And as another aspect, what we say is, a lot of money is actually going into the financial sector, you know, which is often also argued going to support local businesses. Fair enough, but then there's very limited, if no really information or actually evidence, you know, that those credits, for example, those loans would be more accessible, you know, to the low income, to the SMEs. And indeed, they say that actually offering lower rates would kind of screw the local market. So still, you play with the local players, you know, and actually offering quite high rates. So that access is actually, that problem is actually not really solved with these instruments. Then also, I think I really need to highlight as well here, there's a growing body of evidence, and, you know, recently Oxfam done that, but, you know, there's lots of organizations doing that, about also how DFIs, and I tell broadly, not just BII, you know, really struggle to comply with the sort of, or protect human rights environment through these operations, you know, and there have been, you know, there's lots of evidence about how these various investments are actually subject to, you know, not really the best kind of the practice what you would expect. Another point here, it kind of impact on the ODA and on our aid budget. What I really wanted to highlight currently, if you look at the BII's portfolio, about 11% is going into health and education. So that means we are actually supporting, you know, privatization of public services in these countries, which for us is really, really worrying. And that's where we try to, you know, really, as well as a civil society, push for changes. And just really to conclude, you know, I think as a reflection, I think there is definitely in our conversations, and I think it's also broader, I think there's a need to challenge really these PSI instruments, as in like I don't feel like there's enough evidence to show that the move towards PSIs, there's evidence that they are better instruments to support, you know, tackling the polycrisis and really tackling the structural problems of structural causes of poverty, inequality, and climate change, which are really the fundamental things, you know. And I think that lack of that evidence is what really obviously makes us all concerned, and to see that it's really a very pragmatic approach how to inflate and also privatize, I would say, ODA, you know, really through the private sector mechanisms. I could go on more, but I appreciate the time given to share some of the insights from UK, and maybe in Q&A can talk about some of the stuff more. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. Unfortunately, what you have explained is not quite different from what we have here also from Sarah and Alexandra. I haven't seen any question on the Q&A. I am not sure if it's because of the platform, but I don't know if anyone wants to jump in with a quick question, because we have like 8 minutes. If anyone wants to raise their hand and jump in. Luisa?
Hello, everyone. I was just wondering if there is more information about the case studies that Sarah was mentioning, because it sounds very interesting to look into the effect on the local population.
Yes, we will be launching the report on the 23rd, and we'll definitely circulate it among civil society networks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luisa. Any other question? No? As we have 6 minutes, and it has been really interesting to hear from all of you, yeah, there is one. Celine, so please, just this question because we are running out of time.
Hi, thanks for that. I just wanted to ask Sandra, thank you for your very illuminating case of the BII. Just wanted to ask actually because you mentioned earlier on a statistic, and we could have this offline if you want. 22% of ODA grants goes to private sector instruments, and the BII is a huge part of this. What other mechanisms are they what other mechanisms or facilities are they using in terms of UK aid where this is dispersed aside from the BII? And then you mentioned something, and I'm sorry if I missed the actual statistic, and then you said it will go up to about 1 billion a year, and then this constitutes 7% of ODA. I just got a bit confused with that statistic because it was 22% of ODA goes to private sector instruments, of which the BII is a huge recipient of this. But number one, who are the other recipients? And number two, when you mentioned that it will go up again, and then you kind of mentioned 7% of this is of ODA going to PSI, double of what would be spent in education and health. And I think I missed it. It's not 7%, is it? So I'm not quite sure. Just those two questions. Thank you. If you could clarify.
Thanks, Celine. Sandra?
Yeah, just quickly. So on the 7%. So yes, as per our calculations from 2025. Assuming that we still stay at 0.5, as a total ODA envelope, then the share of ODA which will be going to the BII will reach 7%, compared to where we are kind of between 3 and 4% of total ODA. So that's at 7%. And then just to understand kind of the volume, what it means really with the other kind of things, then I shared, how it relates to the health budget and the education budget and IDA payments through the World Bank mechanism. So hopefully it is clearer, but we can chat a bit more. And on the 22%, maybe this is actually also from an area. So in the report, obviously, you have the table which shows, of average from the 2018 to 21, where UK has 22%. And maybe you can say what you counted in, because obviously this is not only BII. There are other instruments, I imagine guarantees as well, possibly also the MDBs, some MDBs transfers as well.
Thank you. That's really clarified things. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. So one last question from the chat. Any thoughts on recent reports on how ODA money goes to consulting firms such as KPMG? I saw this somewhere recently. I don't know, any one of the panelists can react to that in terms of ODA that is going to consulting. Thomas? You want to address that question?
Yes, I can say what I know, what I can read from the data that we received from our members. And yes, there are some grants that are directed to these companies, but please, these are service contracts. So KPMG and similar companies are paid in order to implement a project. Private sector instruments is not about providing financing to these international giants to open offices in developing countries. It's really not that way. And maybe I can just add a few words on what those new rules that are in place actually aim at, acknowledging that at the international policy level we build ecosystems and frameworks, and we don't work in the field, and so we don't pretend to be any close to the developing countries in the field. But when we set this kind of overarching frameworks, we really try to make sure that we push our members to adopt some standards and standards that will become the norm going forward. And this is where, for example, we are looking at each and every development finance institution or other vehicle that extends private sector instruments, and we look at the mandate, if they are at least mandated to work with the private sector, and if so, what kind of mechanisms they have in place internally to pursue development impact and to make sure that their activities are additional. And I can assure you that already there, in terms of discussions with members, it is not easy, because obviously we are touching something, if you wish, but overall the fact that they will be assessed on whether they have these mechanisms in place or not is very important, because if there are gaps, they need to either provide information that does not reflect the reality, which then I would say the job of CSOs is to hold accountable for, or they need to improve the situation. And this is also something that we have been discussing with one members that are actually setting up new vehicles to work with the private sector. They actually realize that they do not have a mechanism in place that can proactively build impact, and that their model was more on financial additionality side, meaning one should be close to the market turn, one should not crowd out the private sector, but what about the impact? And so they are actually now working to improve that framework and make sure that, if you wish, their activities are more developmental. And then it does not end at the level of the institution. We request information on each and every activity of that vehicle, and each and every activity needs to be then reported on the intended development impact and also additionality. And this is like what we can probably at our level do to build a system that I guess we want to see ideally.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. So we are run out of time. So I will ask all the panelists just a last phrase in terms of going forward, what we can do to address this threat that we are seeing very clearly from what is the report that comes from Eurodat, also the stories from Sarah and what Sandra, Alexandra, and Sarah has shown. So let me start with Alexandra. One phrase to encourage.
Okay, if I would have to pick one phrase, Javier, then I would pick to democratize the governance of these institutions. Because if they become more representative of the people that actually receive these finance sources, it will change a lot on transparency and accountability.
Thanks, Alessandra. Sarah, you want to come in?
Maybe just ramping up transparency and accountability mechanisms.
Good. Sandra?
I'll go for localize. I think it has to be for local people, by local people, and with local people. So that would solve also a lot of the issues we are currently discussing.
Okay. Thomas, you want to encourage us going forward?
Yes, I would like to encourage you going forward. I think that it's important to seek to understand each other better, business, private sector, ODA world. And for the CSO community, please do monitor and hold accountable members of the Development Assistance Committee. It is important.
Thanks. And finally, Nerea.
My last minute, it also goes into the direction of monitoring going forward. So it is very important for us in our role of watchdogs of aid to continue monitoring what is happening with ODA. What is the impact of these agreements, PSI, on the global levels of ODA? How many grants are still reaching the global south? How much resources are still reaching the global south? So I think I would call for us to continue monitoring these flows and what happens with them. And then when we see whether something goes wrong, to call for change of these rules. As Thomas was saying before, they don't need to be permanent, they can be changeable. So also for for that, to call for change when we see that is going wrong.
Thanks a lot, Nerea, and thanks all the panelists. I think it's very clear that we have ahead a collective task from the local communities to put stories into the figures, as Sarah has said, to monitor what's going on with the DFI institutions, as Sandra and Alexandra has explained, and also is very much needed Eurodad's work around putting all of these pieces together in this report, which is quite important, and I think the link is on the chat. And I hope OECD can continue to improve the reporting system, because we need transparency and real figures behind that to understand what is the real impact happening at the local level. So let me conclude here, thanking all for your participation and particularly the panelists, and because the time was very short and you have made a great effort for that. So thanks a lot.